My fellow Americans, welcome to The Celluloid President, the podcast about American presidents on film. Today we're discussing All the President's Men, the 1976 journalism thriller about Watergate and the Washington Post.
I, Richard Nixon, do solemnly swear I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States, that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
I'm Gary Holmes, and joining me today via Zoom from California is Jim Robinson. Jim, now that Deep Throat is taken, what would your porn nickname be?
I don't know, Bill Clinton.
Okay.
Well, this is the celluloid president, Gary.
Yeah,
to somehow relate it to.
All right. Well, celluloid.
How about you?
I think it's obvious. John Holmes.
Maybe in your next life.
Maybe in my next life. You know, the truth is that when my son was born, I did consider that we should name him John because my wife's brother is named John, and I like the name John, and I was dissuaded from it, and I'm glad that I was because he's still famous. I mean, even today, we were joking about Holmes, and I mentioned John Holmes, and everyone, all the guys in the room knew what I was talking about. So
yeah.
All right. So to switch briefly from switch completely from porn to Christmas, natural segue. We're recording this before Christmas and we're talking about movies. And I know, Jim, that you've been doing a deep dive into the Noel Christmas, the celluloid Christmas. So you want to tell us what you've been watching and what actually are your favorite movies? We've never even talked about this.
You're right, Gary. What I did was, in addition to watching the Christmas movies that I always watch every year, I watched some that appallingly I've never seen before. And one of them was Miracle on 34th Street.
Yeah.
And I quite enjoyed that. I thought it was going to be complete sugar and schmaltzy, but it was actually kind of dramatic. And I really enjoyed that. And then I watched for the first time ever, It's a Wonderful Life. And I thought it was very well done. I love the ending, of course, because it's very touching. But in general, I found that kind of dark for my taste at Christmas. And I think you like that one, don't you?
Yeah, no, it's one of my favorite. There's a holy trinity of Christmas movies that I watch, and I don't watch them all every year because that would be overdoing it. But It's a Wonderful Life, which is a very nostalgic experience for me because I used to watch it when I came home for Christmas from college and with my high school friends. And the darkness is part of the point, I think, because once you come out of the darkness, you come into this extravagant life. And of course, this was made after World War II when Jimmy Stewart and Frank Capra were pretty depressed about what they had seen during the war. So
they were really in the war.
Jimmy Stewart was probably the Hollywood star that saw most action. I mean, he was a bombardier. He went on 40 bombing raids or something. So he was totally there. And of course, Frank Capra ran the whole propaganda, movie propaganda thing for the U.S. government. So he was actually a colonel in the army during the war, and he was the boss of all the propaganda stuff. So that means he would have seen some really horrible footage.
Right. So what's the rest of your holy?
So the other one is A Christmas Story. I mean, these are. Do you know what I'm talking about with A Christmas Story?
I've seen it once.
Okay.
It was okay for me.
Yeah. Okay. Love it. Christian and I, my son Christian, and I used to watch it all the time, and it still holds up. It's like I feel like that's my childhood Christmas was like that. And the third one is Elf.
I've never seen that one.
Yeah, so that's the Will Ferrell movie where he plays human that gets adopted by elves up in the North Pole, and he comes back to find his real father. Very, very, very funny. You should watch that. So what are your favorites?
Yeah, I think I'll check it out. Well, I tend to like any of the Scrooge Christmas Carol movies. The older, the better. And I'm embarrassed to say a little bit my favorite is actually Mr. Magoo's Christmas Carol,
right,
in which I remember from being a kid, the cartoon version. I thought that was great. My every year must watch films are National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation with Chevy Chase. There's just some great comedic bits in that. Um, I watch Home Alone every year, but the number one isn't really a movie, but it's Charlie Brown Christmas,
Right. Well, yeah.
which I could recite probably by heart. But I remember actually watching the very first showing of that in 1965 in my living room with my PJs on and all that. Do you remember the first time you saw that?
Oh yeah, I remember we were coming. I remember walking home from school talking with my friends about how we were going to watch Charlie Brown Christmas that night. And Charlie Brown Christmas is probably the one piece of video art or that I've watched more than anything else. So I'm with you. I
Yeah, and
can almost report it.
unfortunately, and it was even struggled over back then. It's probably too religious today to be made, which is ridiculous because it's a wonderful story.
Yeah. All right. So we're now that deeply we've dived deeply into nostalgia. Our movie is also very nostalgic for us because this happened when we were in high school and in college.
Yeah, I was very like you. I followed Watergate in all its minutia and detail and got very invested in the whole thing, right through the resignation and beyond.
Well, this movie begins on July 17th, 1972, which is the date of the actual break-in, and that's just a few days after my high school graduation. And I completely forgot that this happened when I was still in high school. And it ends with the inauguration, which is just 7 months later. So it doesn't cover the whole Watergate period at all. What do you remember? I mean, you and I sort of bonded in college over Watergate, but I don't even remember thinking about Watergate at all during our entire freshman year. It seemed like it sort of. When do you remember being aware that Watergate was a problem?
Well, I remembered it as soon as it happened, but here's the amazing thing, Gary. The Watergate bugging was a success because the bugging did not take place on June 17th. That was when they were caught going in a second time. The real bugging was May 28th, and it was a success. They got in there, they planted bugs, and they got out without being caught. And that's hardly even known, or if it's known, it's not remembered by nearly anybody.
Well, they got the bugging part was a success, but the listening to the what was being recorded was not the success. That's why they had to go in a second time, I think.
Right. But I mean, I wonder how many people, because we actually make fun of the fact that they were so ham-handed that they got caught. I wonder how many people even realize that June 17th arrests, was not the first bugging of the Watergate. It's an interesting historical thing to me,
All right.
that it actually happened.
Well, this movie is based on a book written by Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, the Washington Post reporters who were on the Watergate beat. The book itself came out in 1974 before Nixon resigned. I read it that summer, and I've since thrown it away with all my other Nixon books when I decided to make a break with my past. I remember when I read it, I thought that it was pretty compelling with straightforward, no nonsense writing, but you've actually gone back and reread it. So what's your take on it now?
Yeah, I just reread it after, I think it was the first time since the 70s. And the first half of the book is what the movie covers. There's a whole second half that the movie does not cover. I mean, it hits highlights in that teletype,
Yeah.
stuff at the end of this movie. But the first half is pretty dry and dull. I mean, it's very passive voice. They don't refer to themselves in the first person, and it's just a sort of a very tick-tock kind of laying out of the story as the movie is. And it's in the second half of the book that you get more engaged because, the fish that are being fried are bigger in the second half. Mitchell Dean is not even introduced till the second half of the book, and Haldeman as well. So I would say the book it picks up a lot at the second half, which ironically is not covered in the movie.
Right, right. Well, I remember, I mean, you have your book and you brought it to the Watergate trial. We were when we were in college, you spent the fall semester of our junior year in Washington, and I guess things were a lot different back then, but you actually went to the trial, right?
Yeah, it was incredible. I mean, I was, a student at American University, and the Watergate trial of all the president's men was underway in downtown Washington. And I had heard that, they were letting some members of the public in because the cases, what trials are technically open to the public. And I went down there the night before that I wanted to get in and to join the line. There were people willing to camp out all night to get in. And I got there, like around 11 at night, planning on getting in my sleeping bag and camping out all night. Fortunately, they gave tokens to people that were in line. I think they had 30 seats. And if you got a token and you came back at the right time the next morning, you could get in. I did that and I got in. And it was amazing to me how small the courtroom was. It was also amazing to me that when the judge retired to his chambers, Judge Sirica, with the lawyers to have a private conference, there was no security that prevented me from walking through the little gate right up to the defendants' tables. And I went up and I chatted with each of the defendants, with Haldeman, with Ehrlichman, with John Mitchell, and I got them to sign my All the President's Men book because their pictures were in the book. So I'm looking at it right now. Hello, Jim, John D. Ehrlichman. To Jim, Bob Haldeman. And then a very shaky John Mitchell. And then because I noticed he was in the audience, I also have Art Buchwald signing
Okay.
my book because he was there that day, and Rick Benvenisti, one of the prosecutors. So it was quite an experience for me. I can't believe that I was able just to, these are high profile defendants in a very controversial case, just walk through the gate between the audience and the defendants and went up to them and chit chatted.
Well, that was then. This is now. You probably couldn't
Yeah,
do it again. All right. Well, let me do a quick summary of the
sure.
movie, and then we can dig in a little bit to the movie. So, All the President's Men tells the now familiar story about how Woodward and Bernstein supposedly broke the Watergate story. This is part detective story and part thriller, as the two reporters make a lot of phone calls, knock on a lot of doors, ask a lot of questions, and slowly learn that the break-in wasn't a small rogue operation, but is somehow connected high up at the committee to re-elect the president and ultimately to the White House. The movie begins on June 17th, 1972, the night that 5 Cuban refugees and one former CIA operative were arrested breaking into the Democratic headquarters, and ends almost 7 months later on January 20th, 1973, the day of Richard Nixon's second inauguration. So that means it doesn't cover any of the, as you've discussed, Jim, it doesn't cover any of the high profile discoveries that we associate with Watergate, like the hearings, the resignations, or the fight over the tapes. The movie stars Robert Redford as Bob Woodward, Justin Hoffman as Carl Bernstein, and Jason Robards as the Post executive editor Ben Bradley. This is the movie in which Woodward had several late night meetings in a creepy parking garage with a top secret source named Deep Throat, who tells them to follow the money. Got anything to add?
Well, it's interesting that follow the money never appears in the book.
Right.
So that's just one example of filmic license, but that's okay. I think the key point, just to reiterate, is that we see the Watergate case in this movie really at its beginning, not during its most dramatic phases. And I think ultimately, I think that was smart because what we could see then was neophyte Woodward and Bernstein forging their partnership, a rather shaky partnership because they were so different in personality. And also, it was a time when they pretty much had the Watergate story all to themselves. And the second half of the book really brings out the fact that their dominance over the story, it really didn't last that long and came to a sudden end. And pretty soon, everybody was in on the act in the media, and lots of people were breaking big stories that had not and were scooping Woodward and Bernstein. And then the other thing I would say, the movie did show and did almost end with a big high profile mistake on their part, which I thought was really good. It added a lot of credibility. That was not just making them into they could do no wrong kind of heroes. The second half of the book shows a lot more mistakes, a lot more questionable ethical behavior on their part, and it also shows how they really did get captured into making this a huge mission to get Nixon. Um, and the first half of the book showed that of them being a little more circumspect, a little more humble. So those would I just wanted to bring out a few more changes and differences between the book and the movie.
Well, the book and the movie itself both have a somewhat unusual history. This none of this would have come about if Robert Redford hadn't been a political junkie. He noticed these Washington Post stories and he called Woodward on the phone and suggested that he write a book because he wanted to make a movie about it. And Redford was the one who suggested that the book make the two reporters the main protagonists and tell it from their perspective and write it in the third person and so forth. So the book might not have even been made without Redford's encouragement.
See,
Um,
Gary, this is a vast left-wing conspiracy.
I know, is ever one hand washes the rest.
Yeah.
So Redford was the driver behind the whole project. He was the producer. He hired the director and the cast, including Dustin Hoffman. He also hired William Goldman, who worked with him on Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Goldman wrote about this movie in his autobiography, Adventures of the Screen Trade, which you read the whole book. You read the whole All the President's Men. I went back and read The Adventures of the Screen Trade chapter in which he talks about it. So he turned in his first screenplay. Bernstein didn't like it, so he and his future wife, Nora Ephron, wrote an entirely different version, which had many, many, many more fictionalized elements than Woodward and the director. Ellen J. Pakula wrote another new version, but in the end, it was Goldman who got the screenwriting credit. Although he says now it was the worst experience in the world writing this movie because there was of all the egos involved.
Well, it may have been like making sausage, but it turned out to be a pretty damn good script in my view.
Yeah, no, it's a very, I mean, very well written and very compelling, and it moves right along. I do like it, and it was a big hit. I mean, it was
Well,
ranked
with the Redford and Bernstein, with the Redford and Hoffman, fairy dust sprinkled over it. How could it not be, right?
well, and it was literally ripped from the headlines, right? I mean, you usually don't
Mhm.
see this in the movies. You usually don't see a movie that's made of something that's like right of the moment because it takes so long to write these books, I mean, write the movies and do the screenplays and hire people and but the cast, but this movie came out 1976. Now that was after Nixon had resigned.
But it was during when? Do you know what month it came out offhand?
No,
Because 76, of course, was the year when, the presidential election, when
yeah.
the Republican Party was actually asking for another term after both of their president and vice presidential nominees resigned in disgrace 2 or 3 years earlier. So
And Jerry
the
Ford
movie,
almost won that year too.
uh,
So anyway.
the movie sort of it might have served a political purpose too.
Anyway, it was a big hit, ranked number 5 that year with a total domestic box office of $51 million. Rocky you remember, was the number one movie that year with a box office of 117, followed by A Star is Born, your favorite version, the one with Barbara Streisand, King Kong, and Silver Streak. Very highly regarded at the time, nominated for 8 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Best Director. It won 4 Oscars. William Goldman, for all his complaining, won the Best Screenplay, and Jason Robards won for Best Supporting Actor. For several decades, it was on the American Film Institute's list of 100 greatest movies. And the only other film that we've watched that's on that list is Doctor Strangelove, which is actually fictional. So,
It was hard to watch this when I watched this movie, and like especially scenes at the Watergate and all that. I kept expecting the girls from Dick to pop out from
I
nowhere
know. I know.
because for those that haven't seen Dick, you can check out our podcast on that. But it's a comedic depiction of Watergate, including a comedic depiction of the All the President's Men film.
Well, and in Dick, the girls, these two teenage girls who have a crush on Nixon, they're deep throat, and
And they crack the case, not Woodward and
they
Bernstein.
crack the case, not Woodward and Bernstein. And Woodward and Bernstein get a severe taking down in that movie. So this movie is told in quasi documentary style. The producers go to great lengths to make sure everything looked the same as it did in real life. They even created an entire Washington Post newsroom in Hollywood. In some respects, the world depicted in this movie is very similar to ours. I think movies at around 1970, movies from then on feel like they're part of our world. But when you watch something like this, it also seems like ancient history. What are some of the things in the movie that you notice that are so different from the way we live now?
Well, the first thing, Gary, is paper, paper, paper everywhere. You
Right.
couldn't get away from paper. And Woodward's apartment was full of scraps of paper, and the newsroom, of course, the the Hunt and
Phone
Peck
books.
typing, the phone books, the typewriters, the polyester, the bad neckties, the terrible haircuts. There was so much. I mean, it just reminded me, as you know, I'm not a huge fan of the 70s stylistically. I thought when the 60s stylistics were adopted by
Yeah.
the middle class America of the 70s, you got some really grotesque outcomes, including, I'm sure, yours truly. And
Well,
they,
we've well, I sometimes I go back and look at the pictures from when we were in college, and it's like, oh, terrible. But you can see it in like Bernstein's hair. He's got this long,
right,
these long flowing lock. Even Woodward has long hair and these long sideburns, and the two of them, they look so much younger than the gruff, grizzled newsroom veterans.
right,
Well, what you're getting at with all this paper is there was no internet, right? So there's no
right,
phones, no Googling. So to find out information, they need to go to phone books, like instead,
right,
like something that would take us 5 seconds, they have to go through phone book after phone book after phone book
right.
to find the addresses of the White House or the committee to reelect the president employees.
And go through, spend all night going through little slips at the Library of Congress,
Right,
just
right.
and
When
then not finding what they wanted to find. And
um,
let me cross check you on one thing, Gary. Why do you think this is a quasi documentary? It didn't strike me that way. The only documentary sort of style to it was maybe the teletype stuff at the beginning and the end when they had a screen images of things, superimposed on the screens. Wasn't it just people's names rather than, and there was no narrator either. So why do you consider this? And what it was a procedural movie, which is, I
well,
think, different in my mind than documentary.
Well, it's a document. I'm not. It's not like it's documentary style. That you get these unsteady cameras sometimes, like you'd see in a documentary.
Yeah, that's right.
Um,
That's
you
true.
get you get. There's a scene where Hoffman is talking to former girlfriend, and the plane comes over and what he's saying is drowned out. They didn't fix that. And this whole idea of recreating the newsroom to make it look real. It's obviously not a documentary, being fictionalized, but they really try and show you exactly what it was like to do the work. I just wanted to highlight a couple of other things that I noticed that are different. There's no women in any position
Right.
of power anywhere. I mean, there's one female reporter who plays an important role, but aside from that, all the members, all the president's men are men. Obviously, it's in the title. Everyone in the newsroom of any power is men. At the committee to reelect the president, they're all men. It's a man-driven thing, and there is the Washington Post was owned by a woman, but they didn't include her in this. I mean, the Catherine Graham is not in this movie at all. They talked a lot about who they were going to cast to play her part, but in the end, they decided not to include her at all.
Well, we had to wait for the Post
Right,
to do that, in which there was a lot of chauvinism there too. But she was nonetheless portrayed as a strong woman. It's interesting that the two women reporters or staffers that figured in the movie, the way they figured in the movie was to take advantage of their dating histories.
right, right.
So so there was that, and there was also tons of smoking.
Exactly. Smoking is a big. I couldn't believe it. It just reminds you of how much it was just a natural thing to do. The other thing that killed me is when they broke into the DNC headquarters. They were fairly confident that no one would be there. Can you imagine, like, in a presidential headquarters nowadays without, like, you'd be working full time, right? People
Right,
used to go
right,
home at 8 o'clock. If you were working late, you'd go home at 8 o'clock. People used to go home at 6, and the office was completely empty. And I just thought, like, wow, that was the way. Those were the good old days when we weren't working like constantly.
right, right.
And the other thing I noticed too was how easy it was to get someone on the phone. There was no caller ID or voice
Yeah,
answering.
people answered their telephones.
I mean, Woodward Bernstein able to get John Mitchell on the phone in his at his house. I mean, he's just, yeah, like, give me John Mitchell's apartment, and sure enough, Mitchell picks up the phone. I mean, you have to go through 3 layers of PR people to talk to John Mitchell nowadays. So before we dig into a little deeper, like, who would you recommend this movie to?
Well, anybody that is a Watergate junkie,
Yeah,
and there are some of us left, uh, people who like movies about journalism and
yeah,
reporters and journalists as heroes,
yeah,
that kind of thing, politics. And so I think the categories are pretty
yeah.
easy to discern
I got the
in
same. I
this
mean,
case.
like I've got the same list myself. So, all right.
The other thing is, I'm sure the presence, there were no women in the movie to speak of, but I'm sure the presence of Robert Redford and Dustin Hoffman brought women into the theaters. They were
Yeah,
bankable stars, very bankable stars.
yeah. I mean, if you're a Robert Redford fan, this is a good. I would recommend this movie to you because he looks great. He looks like a movie star.
Yeah.
What So what did you like about the movie?
Well, I liked, I thought it worked very, very well as a sincere procedural crime and reporting drama. They didn't really have much drama to work with.
Yeah,
So they had to try to infuse drama into it. And some of that was phony. Some of the paranoid scenes of being on the scary streets of Washington and being scared and going into dark parking garages in the middle of the night. But I still thought that taking us from A to B to C to D on how the story was broken, I thought was done very, very well, considering they did take the boring parts of the book and not the exciting parts of the book.
yeah. I agree with you. I mean, one of the things I liked about the movie is, and I'm actually a bit of a sucker for movies that show you how a job is done in like step by step detail because it's just really interesting to me for how other people do their jobs.
Yeah, it showed that hard work is more important than genius.
Yeah. Well,
And
exactly.
speaking of two people probably who whatever success we've had, in our careers was probably attributed more to hard work than genius. Don't you think?
Um, yeah, right.
That's
Probably.
for damn, that's for sure.
A particular thing I noticed in the movie though is also that it shows you how low level people can accomplish things that big wigs can't because they don't have the powerful sources who wave them off of something. So and this is something I learned from you when we were working in Washington together. If you're some lower down in the totem pole and you have your friends are low level people at places, you can usually get things and find things out from them because these low level people hear things and they're more likely to tell you. I mean, cultivating sources at the low. I mean, I remember the time that you were at the chamber and they tried to get a copy of the President's State of the Union, and you were the only one who was able to get it because you knew people at the White House in the speechwriter's office.
Yeah, I was a low level person and I got big secrets from other low level people.
Yeah, so you
And
see
that,
that in this movie, which I
yeah,
appreciate. I also what I liked is this, just a nostalgic trip down memory lane. I mean, all the names and the details I haven't thought of in years. They were all there, and it made me feel like I was 20 years old again, you know?
well, adding to that, Gary, I love the aerial shots of Washington.
Yeah,
And it was nostalgic. To me, it was a nostalgic experience to see Washington in the 70s
yeah,
again. When I was there, during that special semester in 74, and you came to visit, don't forget,
yeah.
um, they didn't even have the metro yet.
Oh,
They had a lot
okay.
of streets torn up. But when I tell my younger friends that I was in Washington before the subway even existed, they basically their mouths drop open. They say, "I can't imagine that." So it made me nostalgic for Washington to see
Yeah.
this film.
Well, exactly. That was really kind of our Washington. I mean, I was there in the 80s, not the 70s, but it wasn't that far different from this. I liked also that it didn't make them complete heroes. They're not, well, they were the hero, but they weren't, you didn't see them with complete white hats. I mean, they show how they're manipulative, how they bullied and lied to their sources.
Flirtatious when
Yeah,
needed.
Bernstein uses his old girlfriend to get a copy of the employees at the committee. And then we also talked about that scene where there's a female reporter, who in the movie is called Sally Aiken, which is not her real name. She tells them a communications person has claimed credit for a particular dirty trick while she was in his apartment. He's a married man, and what is he doing in her department? And they basically blackmail this guy into confirming the story in return for not mentioning that he was in her apartment, which would have ruined his marriage. So,
Yeah, and of course the penultimate mistake shown is when they misunderstood or heard what they wanted to hear about Haldeman being named in grand jury testimony by Hugh Sloan, who was one of their
yeah,
key sources and who was portrayed as a good guy. And they misunderstood. And Sloan, in fact, didn't mention Haldeman. They weren't wrong about Haldeman's role in the fund
right,
that they were focused on, but they were wrong that Sloan named him in the
right.
grand jury. And that really took them down a peg. And I think it was very important to have that in there.
Well, that's right, because and the movie ends very soon after that, where they get back to work. I mean, the movie ends with them literally both sitting in the Post newsroom while Nixon's inauguration is being broadcast, and the other reporters are watching the inauguration, and they're just working. They're getting back. They get back on their horse and go back and do it again. So,
Yeah.
so what didn't you like about the movie?
Well, some of it gets into our history
Yeah.
discussion, which we'll have, but they didn't show a lot of context to the things, to the evil deeds that they were uncovering. They didn't. Um, they were a little too histrionic about those. For example, the whole idea of ballyhooing the fact that Howard Hunt went to the Library of Congress and tried to get books on Chappaquiddick. And they made that into a big deal in the movie. So what? And the whole idea of opposition research, getting a book that's been published about the Kennedys is somehow some tip of the iceberg evil deed. I thought they overplayed some of those things. Um,
I
and so
thought,
it was basically some of that, you know.
yeah. I mean, I tell you what, I liked the movie. I thought it was compelling, but I also thought it was a little long. I personally felt my interest lagging at the end, especially when they got into a lot of detail about this mistake they made with Haldeman being named by Hugh Sloan and blah blah blah. Um, I also thought the casting was not really right. Woodward and Bernstein were only 28 and 29 at the time, and they were played by these two huge, gigantic movie stars who were 10 years older than them, more than 10 years older than them. So you can't quite appreciate how young and inexperienced and vulnerable they were. You know, they're already fully grown men, played by fully grown men, and instead of like guys that are in their 20s, who's desperate for it. So the power imbalance is not quite there in the movie because they're the biggest stars in the world. And, you know, someone's yelling at them. Well, you know that no one's really going to yell at Robert Redford.
That's true, Gary, but I think later on, things that we learned about Woodward show that he was much more of a sophisticated player in Washington
Right.
than the movie was able to, that the movie indicated at the time and was able to indicate at the time. When we learned that decades later that Mark Felt, the number two guy at the Federal Bureau of Investigation, was a prior contact of Bob Woodward. Junior guys don't have contacts like that.
Well, what
And
is
that was out of his naval intelligence experience.
right.
And so I think that it couldn't have been known when the film was made, but later on, we realized that Bob Woodward was not just some podunk local reporter at a Montgomery County weekly newspaper that just suddenly landed at the Washington Post.
No, but you know what I mean. I mean, he was yeah, he'd made a lot of contacts because he was assigned during his naval intelligence career. He was assigned to the White House, I think, for a time. So he knew a lot of people, no question about it. But you know, he was still only 6 months into his job at the Washington Post, and you know he was working local debt. I mean, he wasn't he the lowest of the low in a place like the Washington Post is people that cover local crimes and that kind of thing. So he was, and they were about to. They do say that they were about to fire Bernstein because you know he wasn't doing a very good job. So those guys were on tenterhooks. And it just doesn't, by having major stars doing it, major older stars, I just think it would have been more, the tension would have been there if they had picked slightly less gigantic movie stars.
Yeah,
Um,
what the thing that didn't work for me sometimes was I know they had to strain to infuse drama and
well, yeah,
suspense. And some of that just didn't work. And now you could chalk that up to paranoia of the characters and not genuine danger or suspense. And paranoia, I guess, is something that the director was known for
yeah,
trying to portray in movies. But, you know, this whole idea of lives in danger, that line did appear in the book, but
yeah,
not till much later in the narrative. The idea of being wiretapped and all that. The book finally admits, grudgingly toward the end, that no, nobody was wiretapped and their lives weren't in danger. And sometimes I think trying to infuse drama into what was basically a crime procedural drama didn't work for me.
I agree with you. This is a very boring story. And they somehow managed to turn it into a thriller. And I know you're not going to like this, Jim, but this reminds me of JFK. Same thing. You've got a DA doing an investigation, going out and talking to a lot of people, and all of a sudden everyone's lives are at stake, and there's a big conspiracy. I mean, Mark felt the Deep Throat is basically the same character as Donald Sutherland in JFK, where there's the conspiracy runs deep, and so I wonder if I'm sure that Oliver Stone must have looked at All the President's Men before he made JFK and built on it. I mean, he just like
Oh, I'm sure
turned the
that's
dial up to
actually,
11.
yeah, that's a good point. I kept thinking of all this lives are in danger talk that if Woodward's life was in danger, it was the ridiculousness of walking around dark, empty
Oh,
streets of Washington at
exactly.
3 a.m.
Well, you're
I
right. I,
mean,
I mean, it was kind of stupid where they have, like they're in a parking garage, and all of a sudden you hear the squealing tires. It's like, oh my God, what's that? It's like, well,
yeah, I'm amazed. You spoke about this earlier about people working decent hours in those days. So the Watergate guys felt they could go into Watergate. You know, um, why would they not think that a parking garage would have constant activity all night as well? They sure do now.
yeah, yeah. There's I'll just say one other thing that I didn't um talk. Well, no, actually, there's two other things. So I'm a Watergate junkie like you, and if you're not a Watergate junkie, I think this movie would be hard to follow. It's a complicated story. Even I got lost a couple times about who was doing what to whom. Who was at the White House and who was at the committee to re-elect the president, and who was a former CIA agent, and who was freelancing. I mean, there's a lot they're throwing a lot of names at you. In 1976, when this came out, everyone would be familiar with the news that had just been reported, so it wouldn't be that hard to follow. But for someone watching brand new to Watergate, I think that would be kind of hard to follow.
Yeah, I agree.
And the other thing that sort of got on my nerves in this movie was all these cryptic hints from their sources. I mean, Deep Throat talks in riddles. Why are you meeting with me if you're not going to tell me this thing? You just and this whole reason they made that mistake with Hugh Sloan, when they're like, I'm going to count down to 10, and if you don't deny it by the time I get to 10, then I'll assume that it's confirmed. So they go through this whole elaborate thing, and then he misunderstood. He
Right.
thought it was the exact opposite, so he doesn't say anything, and they're all like jumping around, and so all of that, and this whole idea, which at one point, he's talking. Woodward, no, Bernstein is talking to someone like, well, who knows who else has control of the money? You won't tell me their name. Well, can you at least tell me their initial? Was it an F? Was it an M? It was an M. I know it was an M. It's like, what is it's like,
Well,
come
that
on. Is
that
that
was
what
part of
reporting is
the
really like?
yeah, that's part of the procedural
Yeah,
aspect of
I
this, where
guess.
they're unearthing clues one at a time. And I thought, considering what they had to work with,
No, I mean, yes,
I thought they put it together pretty well.
they make it's exciting. Well, what do you think the movie is what are these guys trying to accomplish?
Well, I think on one level, they're trying to show journalists as the heroes in
Right.
this story.
Exactly. Yep.
And we can't overlook this has spurred subsequent generations of Woodward and Bernstein wannabes. Everybody wants to crack the next Watergate. This was actually a long line in a continuum of presentation of journalists and authors and writers as heroes, if you will, as people who are bringing about social change, going all the way back to Upton Sinclair, who technically wasn't a journalist, but he was a muckraking writer who, a year after he brought out his expose of the meatpacking industry, got the Food and Drug Administration law passed, way back, more than a century ago. So I think that was the basic purpose.
Yeah, I mean, until Watergate, reporters were pretty raffish. A lot of them didn't go to college; they just got into it because they couldn't think of anything better to do. But Woodward was from Yale, and then he was played by Robert Redford. And after that, journalism became a legitimate place for Ivy Leaguers to work. The second thing is, you mentioned this movie came out in '76, which of course was a bicentennial year. So there was a burst of patriotic fervor throughout the country. The movies that came out in the late '60s and early '70s, like The Last Picture Show, Nashville, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, MASH. I mean, these are deeply, deeply cynical movies. And we start to see a turn in 1976. The biggest hit of the year was Rocky, which is the feel good story if there ever was. And this movie, although it's about malfeasance in government, shows that America and institutions are basically good. The system works, supposedly. I mean, the system works, I guess, if you have the right politics, right?
Yeah, I think
That's
it's
what they're trying to say.
yeah, it's a morality play where the white hats are not totally perfect. They make mistakes, they get eager, they have ambitions, but uh, the good guys won in this case, and that's what the movie wanted to show. And it was just pure, purely copacetic that the good guys happen to be those that liberal Hollywood thinks are the good guys,
Right.
and with the bad guys being those that Hollywood likes to think are always the bad guys.
So I don't know if this is the right place to get into it, but I mean, you mentioned how devastating Watergate was to the American psyche. Nixon was elected by a landslide in 1972. And less than 2 years later, he's deposed by these good guys, the guys that are celebrated over and over again. His supporters, even the ones who thought he probably did something wrong, strongly believe that Kennedy and LBJ had done the same stuff, and they didn't get deposed. They got valorized. So they'd use the IRS, the FBI, and the CIA against their enemies, and they were all covered up. And I think the fact that one side's president gets thrown out and the other side's president becomes a hero really worms down into the psyche of Republicans ever since. And people who try and talk about how can't understand why Republicans are so angry, it's because of movies like this where and things and stuff that happens where they're always seen as the bad guys and so even though this movie does probably thinks it's patriotic and showing that America is great, I think of some of the rest of us, you take away a slightly different interpretation.
Yeah, nothing is. This is my main historical complaint, which we'll cover, but very few things are put in context.
Yeah.
And when as they unfold the indictment, if you will, small I indictment against the Nixon campaign and against the administration. So as you said, none of the spying that was done by the Democrats is touched upon in this movie. None of the wiretapping. The fact that opposition research is ho hum, and a lot of what was portrayed as the worst thing to our democracy in history, the Donald Segretti stuff, all of that was made such a big deal out of, was really nothing that new. Maybe it was more, better financed and more efficient. The whole idea of this fund, which they cleverly kept calling secret fund. Why was it a secret fund? Everybody that everybody knew about it in the place where the fund was held. It wasn't secret, but they very slyly used words like secret fund, slush fund, that kind of thing. Cash was legal in campaigns until 1971. And a lot of candidates, including Nixon, had cash left over from prior years, had cash that they raised. Everyone was trying to raise cash, Democrat and Republican, right up until the day the new law took effect in 71. So none of that context was pointed out, it was all, oh, cash, cash, cash used to pay for opposition research. Oh my God. So I think that you're right about the resentment that has come in um, on the conservative side ever since.
All right. Well, let's get off our soapbox. And if anyone's still listening out there, thank you. Thank you for following us. Let's talk about the actors. And I'm sorry I got us on this bent, but this is one of my hobby horses. Let's talk about the actors. So Robert Redford, biggest movie star, one of the biggest movie stars in history, coming off Butch Cassidy, The Sting, The Way We Were. He was voted the biggest box office draw 3 times in a row in the 1970s. He looks a little bit like Woodward, very waspy. What do you think about his performance?
I actually thought it was kind of lifeless. All he needs to do is be on screen
Yeah.
to help a movie. I mean, he has a screen presence, no question. But I thought he was kind of a understated, lifeless type of character. It's probably the way the dynamic really worked between Woodward and Bernstein. You see actually this straight man, comedic man, over the top man who is Bernstein. You see that played for laughs in the movie Dick. Um, but I think I just wasn't that drawn to his performance. It's kind of dull.
Well, he's not a really very good actor. He's a tremendous movie star. I mean, when I think of movie stars, it was maybe because he was the biggest movie star when we were in our early 20s, but I think of him as being the classic movie star, but he's not a very good actor. I think he does an okay job portraying Woodward's Yaley style. I mean, you can see him as like a old-fashioned waspy kind of guy. Insidery kind of person. He's fine. I think he's acceptable here, except as I said earlier, I think he's too old.
Yeah. How
Hoffman,
about Dustin Hoffman?
yeah.
Well, I want the hair. I
I
want that
love to
hair.
have that hair. Oh my
Yeah.
God. I love well, Birds.
But
I mean, obviously Redford still now he's
yeah,
like 85 years old, still has a great head of hair.
bad color job, though,
Yeah,
in his case. I think Hoffman, to me, has always been a more substantial actor
right.
than Redford. I think he's proved his chops time and time again. And I thought he had more to work with in terms of the way the characters were written. And I liked him better.
Yeah, I mean, he's a major actor. He won Academy Awards for Rain Man and Kramer versus Kramer, and he was also nominated for The Graduate, Midnight Cowboy, Lenny, Tootsie, and Wag the Dog. So he's a very celebrated actor, and he does play a more volatile reporter and a more aggressive reporter, better writer, and he does a good job of showing the range of techniques that reporters use to get their way. I mean, sometimes he's bullying, sometimes he's trying to be seductive. I already mentioned Nora Ephron. He was married to Nora Ephron, and who's a very famous writer and screenwriter, and he cheated on her when she was pregnant with their child, and that's a big mistake when your wife is a writer. So she wrote a book called Heartburn that detailed this and was turned into a Mike Nichols movie, also called Heartburn, in which Meryl Streep played Efron and Jack Nicholson played Bernstein. And needless to say, Bernstein was not the hero of that story.
It's interesting how in real life um, they played out their parts in
Yeah,
this movie, and Woodward became quintessential establishment as
right,
time went
right,
on,
right.
and prolific, relatively safe, but kind of with his sources sometimes being suspect, and Bernstein became more extreme and off the wall as
Yeah,
time went on.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, Woodward is probably possibly the most famous reporter we've got. And of course, he writes all these long, boring books where, he goes into the White House and everyone tells him stuff and he records it and he, somehow turns it into a book. But
Yeah.
all right, Robards won the Academy Award. Ben Bradley.
I don't think it deserved the Academy Award. I don't know who else was running, but I thought he did. I thought he portrayed an asshole quite well. Um, and, he he portrayed Bradley as I think of Bradley,
Yeah.
arrogant, full of himself, stuffy, but able to put his feet up on the desk, on somebody else's desk, you notice,
Yeah.
you know, um, and have everyone sit around a table at a meeting while they had to have his foot right in their face to show that he was irreverent and all that. It's probably a little bit of a caricature, but I liked it. I liked his
Yeah,
part.
I mean, Ben Bradley didn't want Robards to play him because when he showed up at the Washington Post to scout it out to see what it was like, he seemed a little too diffident. He wasn't deferential enough to Bradley and not schmoozy and stuff. So, but Bradley should really get down on his knees and thank Robards for this performance. It makes him look much more heroic than he probably really is.
Right. And speaking of context, and we're going to come back to this, Gary, so we don't have to get on soapboxes, but we're going to come back to this sort of undercurrent of our bitches. But speaking of context, and if part of the moral of the story is that you've got brave journalists tilting at windmills to expose the corruption of powerful people. Bradley was not just, an important figure in the Kennedy era. He was a best friend of John F. Kennedy. He covered up things for John F. Kennedy. He had no compunction about keeping secrets for President John F. Kennedy. They hung out with each other.
He
This
even wrote a book
close,
about it, bragging about it.
right. So things that Kennedy did would never have seen the light of day compared to things that the Post under Bradley would have been hungry to reveal about Nixon or any Republican.
Absolutely. Okay. Anyone else you want to cite? Jane
No,
Alexander was nominated for Best Supporting Actress. Very fine performance. Very short. I don't know, whatever.
yeah,
Hal Holbrook plays Deep Throat. We now know that Deep Throat was Mark Felt, the deputy director of the FBI, as you noticed and I mentioned. He actually weirdly does look a little bit like Hal Holbrook. I mean, if you look at pictures of
mm,
Mark Felt back then, not mentioned, of course, the reason that Mark Felt was the ratting on Nixon was because he'd been passed over for the top job.
I
So
use I use my word context again. You're right, and to take it one step further, um, he's committing crimes every time he divulges the kind of information he
yeah.
divulged to Woodward. Crimes, or at least the malfeasance that would get you completely fired from the FBI. You're not supposed to divulge FBI secrets to outsiders when you're in the midst of an investigation.
Well, especially not when your motive is revenge for not getting the top job. I mean, oh well. All right, let's turn to the history. The movie implies that the Washington Post brought down the Nixon administration, which is, a very self-serving, self-glorifying interpretation. Nixon was brought down by an overwhelmingly Democratic Congress, an incredibly hostile press corps, of which the Post was a small part, and the justice system. So, I mean, the movie's clever though. By ending the movie when they end it, it doesn't say that they brought him down, but it implies they've run some stories, they've kept it alive a little bit, but the real revelations don't come out until much later. The stuff that does bring him down. So, I think that the Post gets a lot of credit for stuff that they don't really deserve.
It was kind of complex though, because the last scene of the movie where they have that teletype
Mm-hmm.
fast forwarding
Yeah.
um, also shows Nixon taking office for his second term. So, to the extent that the Post was supposedly bringing down Nixon prior to the election, it didn't work. He got reelected overwhelmingly. I see your point, though. I would just say that if you broaden out the history and look at the two real factors that brought down Nixon, it wasn't even the things you mentioned. It was first the tapes, and second, the abandonment of Nixon by Republicans in Congress. Without those two things, nothing that the Post, the New York Times, the Democrats in Congress, the Irvin Committee hearing, nothing would have resulted in his having to resign.
Well, I mean, but the reason they abandoned was because they were under this pressure from the media and the public. The other factor, which you don't mention, is the economy was in the crapper at that point, right? I mean, inflation was much worse than it is now, and unemployment was bad too. I mean, it was a terrible, terrible economy, and so Nixon's policies were not very popular, and I just think and I think people just got sick of the steady drumbeat of negative coverage, and you're right, the Republicans did cave.
Yeah, I'm just responding to your historical issue, and I think considering what it could have been in the hands of these filmmakers, I think they were relatively restrained in how much credit they were taking.
I mean, I think we've talked about our historical problems enough.
Yeah,
Do you have anything more to add? Well,
nope.
let's talk about our favorite scenes. What did you like?
Okay, I'm really going to toy with people. My three favorite scenes were the three scenes that the real Richard Nixon was in.
Okay, yeah.
And I thought it was really interesting that a movie that was that's whose underlying case was the thorough corruption, wide scale corruption of the Nixon administration, the three scenes all had Nixon looking pretty good, image wise,
Yeah.
filmic wise. And usually you don't see that, do you? In negative campaign ads, they always try to take the worst looking pictures of the person they're going after. But the scene where Nixon was going into the joint session of Congress after coming back with a successful SALT agreement with the Russians, he looked really good standing up there in the podium. And I really like that scene. I like the scene where the young people were shouting 4 more years because I was there. I was in that auditorium shouting 4 more years with my 18-year-old cohorts when Nixon was saying, I want you to look back on this vote and say to yourself that your first vote was your very best vote. I
Uh,
was there. And so I have to like that. And even at the very end, when he was taking office for his second term, I love the footage of him and of Pat. And so, ha ha ha, those are my favorite scenes.
okay. Well, I actually I have three favorite scenes too. One of them is the one you just mentioned, the final shot at Woodward and Bernstein typing in the newsroom while Nixon's being inaugurated. It's very evocative of them showing them just doing their job while everyone else is focused on something else. So it was very good. I really liked the editorial budget meeting during which the top editors decide how much space on the front page will be budgeted. You get these
That was
hard,
really interesting. It
you
was
got these
interesting.
hard-edged, like really
Right.
sarcastic guys sitting there, with mordant, black humor sitting
Trying to
around.
outdo each other and show how
Yeah,
clever.
yeah.
Yeah.
Apparently William Goldman, the screenwriter, went to two of those meetings, and he thought it was, so interesting and funny, because guys back then, gruff old guys, and making jokes. So when he wrote the screenplay, put all these jokes in, and they got appalled. They're like, "Oh my God, makes us look like we're not very serious." So they made him take a bunch of the jokes out, but some of them are still in there. So
I
I
like that scene. Yeah.
yeah. I also like the scene where Woodward, where when he writes his first Watergate story and Bernstein pulls it out of the inbox and rewrites it. And Woodward comes over and asks him what the hell he's doing. And he says he's making it better. Jim, you and I have been writers, and you know how infuriating it can be when someone takes your stuff and starts rewriting it. And to his credit, Woodward does look what Bernstein did, and he agrees that it made it better. But he says, "I don't object to what you did, but how you did it." So,
Well, it was really an appalling thing for Bernstein to do because he wasn't a line editor.
right?
You know,
No,
he was, in other words,
he was like he was a cub reporter. Just not he wasn't a cub reporter, but he has been pretty experienced. But he was younger than Woodward, and he was like had the nerve to go take someone else's stuff and rewrite it.
yeah, I like the scene very early on where Woodward was covering the first courtroom appearance. And I like that whole scene because it was humorous
Yeah,
of the lawyer who kept saying, you know, I'm not here. I'm not really here. I just thought that was funny. And they were having fun with each other. Nobody was being pompous yet
right.
or holier than thou. It was just funny. I
Yeah.
enjoyed that scene.
All right, let's talk about some of our favorite lines. You got one?
Well, I already mentioned the Nixon saying, I hope your first vote is your
Yeah.
very best vote.
Okay.
But I also like the line, everybody likes this, where, and it's a famous line of where Mitchell makes the crack about the
Yeah.
publisher, Catherine Graham, saying, tell Katie Graham she's going to get her tit caught in a ringer if she and if she publishes this story. I just thought that was, and that's been quoted so many times.
Well, you
And
got
apparently it's true. It's true.
say what you will about the Nixon guys. They did know how to give a good quote. So Sally Aiken, the reporter who had Ken Closton in her apartment, after being asked if he was trying to impress her to get her to sleep with him, she says, "I guess I don't have the taste for the jugular that you guys have." And, there's a certain human decency that keeps people from asking questions like that. And it shows that they don't care. They'll ask the question just to get their story.
Yeah. Yeah.
Donald Segretti, who was one of the dirty tricksters, he says, "I'm a damn good lawyer, and I'll probably end up going to jail for being disbarred. And I don't know what I did that was so awful."
Yeah. It was interesting that he could plot out the future better than maybe even Nixon was doing. And in all his meetings, he had to try to game plan, Watergate.
Yeah, and he actually, you're right. He ended up going to jail. They may
Briefly.
briefly, yeah. Also, Deep Throat, when he's talking to Woodward, he says, "Forget the myths the media's created about the White House. The truth is, these are not very bright guys, and things get out of hand." And I think you could say that about a lot of stuff that happens in Washington. I mean, we all think that everyone who goes to Washington's geniuses, but you and I have worked there, and we know just a bunch of dumb guys who managed to have gone to college with somebody else. Well, which is what happened in my case, or they were the neighbors with somebody and they get a job in the White House. I mean, a lot of people that work down there are just not that smart because, there's so much turnover. People are coming in and out of there all the time. And to get ahead, all you really kind of need to do is suck up and and play politics.
The meritocracy in the political culture of Washington has a lot of ways where you can shortcut your way to bigger positions than you probably have earned by your abilities. And that happens a lot. And you just hope that you don't have too many nut jobs that
Yeah.
are in that have come along with you after a successful election.
Yeah. A lot of it is
Yeah.
based on luck. What would your take on the relevance of this movie be today?
Well, it's hugely relevant today and mostly in a sad way because of how many journalists and news organizations have diminished themselves by basically becoming partisan propagandists on both sides. So today we're awarding Pulitzer Prizes for journalists exposing a phony story of Russiagate, whereas back then we were giving Pulitzer Prizes to journalists exposing the Pentagon Papers and Watergate. And I think that says a lot and says it all. So I think it's very relevant, and it's very sad what's happened to the journalism profession, in my view.
Yeah, the role of media in driving politics is always relevant, and newspapers and the three networks are not as important as they were. But cable news networks and news sites, websites are still very important. And of course, social media. What we didn't really talk about here is the role of the three networks in driving news coverage, because the Washington Post itself could not do much because it was a local paper. It was only available in Washington at the
And you
time.
didn't go on the internet to
No,
read
you
it.
didn't go to. All right. Could this movie be made today?
Sure, I think it could be. They've made more recent movies. I mean, I've mentioned The Post a few
Yeah.
times from 2017, I think it was, and so I don't see why not. I think it would be harder to be accepted by a lot of segments of the audience because of, again, how much journalists have soiled themselves by participating in conspiracy theories like Russiagate. But I don't see why it couldn't be.
Yeah, you mentioned the Post. Also in 2017, there was the movie Spotlight about the sexual abuse by Catholic priests in Boston. That won the Academy Award. And last year, there was a movie called She Said about how the New York Times broke the story about Harvey Weinstein's predatory behavior, which kicked off the whole Me Too movement. So these movies still get made. So it could definitely get.
I think there's a role for in movies for journalists to be portrayed as heroes, basically, and people that expose wrongs in society and lead to positive change and speak truth to power and all that. I think given the bifurcated nature of our politics and how many journalists have gone full circle to what press used to be in this country, which are organs of one party or the other. I think to the extent we're going to see movies about journalists exposing wrongs, it's probably going to be more outside of Washington, like
Yeah,
the movies you mentioned.
yeah.
And that's a good thing. That's fine.
So if you were a high school teacher, would you assign this movie?
I think I would, or maybe I would choose the Post instead, talk about the Pentagon Papers and that. I think I would show it to high school students because it's inoffensive. It's not really an offensive movie, and but it would sure need a lot of context, which is about the 15th time I've used that word in the last few minutes.
Yeah, I would show it except for one thing. This is rated R because they use the F word so frequently. Without that movie, it would have been rated G. So, but I agree with you. It would be great for a history or journalism class to watch. Not sure the students could follow it without prep beforehand, but I think it could be shown. All right, coming down the home stretch here. What's the grade?
I give it a B. I thought it was a good procedural crime mystery kind of story, and they held their proselytizing in check. But it was a little bit dull and kind of straining for drama where it didn't exist.
Yeah, I liked it more than you did. I would give it an A minus. It I found it again compelling and interesting and well made. I thought the direction by Alan Pula was quite good and somewhat reasonably restrained. So I liked it. I'd give it an A minus. Okay. So, in closing, I want to make sure everyone remembers that we're still available on Apple, Spotify, and Amazon and most podcast platforms, and you can subscribe to us there. We decided our next movie is going to be Steven Spielberg's Amistad, which is about how John Quincy Adams helped free the captives on a slave ship in 1840. So, if you want to go and watch that movie, I've never seen it. I don't think you have, Jim,
No,
but
I'm looking forward to it.
it's a Steven Spielberg movie, just like The Post was, which Jim just mentioned, and we're looking forward to seeing that. So I guess that's it for now. Have a Merry Christmas, Jim.
You too.
Let me know how much you enjoy the National Lampoon's Christmas when you watch it for the 42nd time. And we'll see you next time.
All right. Take
All right.
care.
Bye-bye.
They're breaking in Democratic headquarters. They were bugging the place. What about it? Bernstein, you're both on the story. Now don't get up. Bradford, I'm Bob Woodward of the Washington Post. Mr. Markham, are you here in connection with the Watergate burglary? And not here. Hoffman. Hi, this is Carl Bernstein of the Washington Post, and I was just wondering if you can remember All the President's Men. The story of the two young reporters who cracked the Watergate conspiracy. What? Bernstein! Get in here! At times, it looked as if it might cost them their jobs.
You guys are about to write a story that says the former Attorney General, the highest-ranking law enforcement officer in this country, is a crook.
Their reputations.